Thank you very much, and pleased to be back at Google to talk about this book that I wrote as a consequence of having presided the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations into the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. I was, at the time that I was designated president of this Commission of Inquiry, this was in early 2009, I was ambassador of my country, of Chile, to the United Nations. And I got a phone call while I was vacationing in the south of Chile, in the Patagonia, from the Chief of Staff of the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, asking me whether I would preside this commission that was going to be instituted to investigate the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. Benazir Bhutto had been assassinated at a park in the town, in the city of Rawalpindi, right outside Islamabad, the capital, in December of 2007. I was very surprised about this call because I was a sitting ambassador, and generally individuals that preside commissions of inquiry are former prime ministers, former foreign ministers, or even former ambassadors. But I was an ambassador in office. So I called my President Michelle Bachelet, thinking that she might say, look, this is a bit delicate, better say no. And to my surprise, she said, no, this is an honor for Chile, because Chile is seen as trustworthy, and it's a personal recognition of your role at the UN, so accept. So I had no choice but to relay that, yes, I would accept. I had asked for 24 hours, and I was told that my mission would be one of establishing the facts and circumstances of the assassination. My commission would not be a tribunal that would establish whether someone was guilty or not in the assassination, which made it very complicated because I began to think that it would be a lose-lose situation, because I could not subpoena anyone. Anybody that would be interrogated would be voluntary, and in the end, I would not be able to assign responsibility for the assassination. I would only be able to refer to the facts and the circumstances of the assassination. And on the other hand, I thought the Pakistani public and world public opinion might expect a lot from this commission. They might expect that we will come out with a smoking gun and identifying who did it. But nevertheless, I thought I had to take it up. I never knew exactly why I was chosen, perhaps because I had presided the Al-Qaeda and Taliban Sanctions Committee while my country was member of the Security Council of the UN in 2003, 2004. So I took it up. Then later on, the Secretary General assigned 2 commissioners to work with me, a former Attorney General of Indonesia and a former Deputy Police Chief of Ireland, aside from a sizable staff that helped us. This was perhaps the most challenging endeavor I've been involved in. I've been in politics for quite a while. I was in the resistance to the dictatorship in my country as a young man. I spent time underground. Then later on, I was member of the No Committee that defeated Pinochet in a plebiscite. There's a movie called No. Some of you may have heard it. I was member of that executive committee. And then I had a lot of posts as ambassador to the OAS in Washington, to Brazil, and ambassador to the UN. Aside from being minister in my country, I was Minister, Secretary General of the government. I was Deputy Foreign Minister. So I had a lot of experience, but never had I been put before such a challenge. And sure enough, as soon as we arrived in Pakistan to begin our work, we went into a lot of preparation, of course. A lot of surprises began to to occur. I had some warnings. There was a Pakistani writer that wrote a beautiful piece in the New York Times, saying basically that Pakistan is a land of conspiracy theories, and that is really complicated because everybody's distrustful and make up their own stories about what may happen to public situations and incidents, particularly regarding violence. For example, he said when the Sri Lanka cricket national team was attacked in Lahore, this writer, as he says in the New York Times, he went talking to people in the streets of Lahore, asking, so who do you think did it? And people gathered around him, and some said criminals. Other ones said, no, terrorists of the Taliban. Others said the government. Others said, no, the intelligence agencies. And somebody else said India. So, conspiracy theories are very easily encountered in Pakistan. So that wasn't very easy. In addition to that, Pakistan is a society that has lived half of its independent life under military rule. So that democracy evidently has been very challenged throughout history. And at the time, there was a dictatorship, the dictatorship of Pervez Musharraf, General Musharraf. And precisely, Benazir Bhutto was intent on returning to Pakistan from her self-exile to confront the dictator and to try to recuperate democracy for Pakistanis. And that was the context of her assassination. She was returning to Pakistan after being out for quite a while, mainly living in Dubai and in London. And her idea was to rein in the military, to make sure that the intelligence services would be under the oversight of civilian rule, and to make sure that the country would begin going on a road of development and democracy, and that she was very keen on repairing relations with India, as well. That has always been, the rival in the mindset of Pakistan. And that was the context of her return, and the return had been a return facilitated by the United States and the UK. The United States began to see, even though they backed Musharraf very strongly, because Musharraf assured then to the Bush administration, the Bush-Cheney administration, that the extremists would be pursued by the government. But the government had a lot of dealings with the Taliban, had a lot of dealings with extremists for quite a while, in fact. It wasn't new. And they were playing a double game of collaborating with the U.S., particularly after 9/11, capturing some Al-Qaeda types and even some Talibans. But on the other hand, continuing to have contacts with them and in fact to have strong contacts with them, because in the mindset of the Musharraf government, they needed to have strategic depth into Afghanistan, and that dictated the need to have this relationship with the Pakistani Taliban, that being Pashtuns, most of them were in common with most of the Talibans in Afghanistan. So that was the context, and as Musharraf began to be a problem, the U.S. began to see that increasingly he was not to be fully trusted. They began to see that the best formula for Pakistan would be to have Musharraf, because he was the man of the army that would ensure the fight against terror, and to have Benazir Bhutto that would be the reinstatement of democracy. That was the best of the two worlds. And the idea was even, okay, so why didn't Musharraf remain as president so long as he took off his uniform, and Benazir Bhutto as prime minister. Benazir Bhutto had been prime minister twice before. She had never finished her term. She had been dismissed from office both times, in 88 and then in 93 she has served. So that this was a great challenge. This was a context in which the assassination takes place. She goes back in October of 2007, backed, as I said, with the idea that there's a deal. She begins to have conversations with Musharraf in Dubai to have a deal so that she's allowed to come back without any trials against her, particularly for corruption cases, which was always the reason why any prime minister was dismissed in Pakistan. And on the other hand, Musharraf would take off his uniform, and there would be then a deal. But of course, she was contesting for elections, and Musharraf was of the idea that she should come back after the elections. In other words, in January of 2008, or around New Year's Eve or New Year's. But Benazir Bhutto realized that she had to campaign for her party, the PPP, the Pakistani People's Party. So she decided to come back in October, and Musharraf felt that the deal had been broken, and he was irate about her return. When she returns on the 18th of October, she's received by practically 500,000 people in Karachi, maybe more. The estimates vary, but huge crowds. And she's in a truck driving from the airport to the mausoleum of the founder of Pakistan, Ali Jinnah. And as she goes very slowly, because there's thousands upon thousands of people on the road, there's an explosion and an attack against her. 140 people die. That was the way that she was received. On the other hand, with the love of the people, but on the other hand, with the terrorist attack that took the lives of so many of her partisans. So when we went, this was what we wanted to unravel. But she had actually been killed not in Karachi. She had escaped that and she had been killed in a place in Rawalpindi, which is relatively near Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, in a park called Liaquat Bagh. She had been assassinated immediately after a rally, as she was departing the rally, by a man who had shot at her and with a suicide vest had blown himself up, killing 38 people, and Benazir Bhutto at the same time. Interestingly, the place where she was killed was the same place, a park, where the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, the one who had succeeded the founder, Ali Jinnah, who had died of natural causes. He had been very sick, and a very untimely death, because Pakistan had become independent after the partition with India, and Ali Jinnah was the man to unify the country, and he died. And his successor, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated at that same park, in the same place where 56 years later, Benazir Bhutto would be assassinated. And he was assassinated at a public rally, political rally, by a gunman that shot him and was captured by the crowd. But nevertheless, a sub-inspector of the police comes and shoots the assailant 6 times. So we never know who was behind. Who was he alone, a wolf that attacked that Prime Minister, Ali Khan, Liaquat Ali Khan, or were there other people behind? Up to today, there are controversies about who was behind that assassination. So you can imagine, this is the background of the assassination of Benazir Bhutto at the exact place. Doing the book, I found some unbelievable stories. It so happens that when Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan is assassinated in 1951. He's taken to the military hospital nearby, and there's a doctor by the name of Khan that tries to revive him and fails. When Benazir Bhutto is attacked, she's taken to the Rawalpindi hospital nearby, a different hospital, and the doctor in charge is called Musaddiq Khan. It so happens that Musaddiq Khan is the son of the Dr. Khan that had tried unsuccessfully to revive Prime Minister Ali Khan in 1951. I mean, the ironies of history are unbelievable. Well, but going back to the investigation, and I want to say just a few more things so that you have a chance to ask me questions. I found myself in a world that was very different from what I'm familiar with. I know Latin America very well. And the clues are different because the clues of politics in Pakistan are mixed with the provincial elements, with the religious elements, with the neighboring conditioning, with the influence of outside actors like the United States and the UK in the past. Quite different. And this, as I said, conspiracy theory and this constant leaking of information, which I was very upset at. In fact, the day we are going to go to Pakistan the first time, I'm informed that my communications have been hacked, so that we are very vulnerable. So I tell the people at the security at the UN, and they said, well, perhaps you shouldn't go. And I said, no, I have to go. And this was hours before I had to take the plane. And they said, well, let's continue talking while you stop in Dubai, because that was, the stopover that we had to go to Islamabad. And when I arrived there, they communicated, they said, well, we've been thinking about it. If you decide to go, you can go, but stay within the red zone, which is the security zone within Islamabad. And I said, well, I thank your suggestion, but I can't, because the first thing I have to do is go to Rawalpindi to go see the site of the assassination. That's symbolically very important to the people of Pakistan, and it's important to me. So what I decided was that we would arrive there and we would go to Rawalpindi. But there were a lot of press following us, and possibly people that might want to harm us. The first surprise that I had was we were at a security house because we couldn't stay at any hotel. We couldn't stay at any place of public access because of the dangers that would entail. And the first surprise is that the cook, who spoke only Urdu, he did not speak a word of English, had my detailed agenda. And I said, how could the cook have all this information? And somebody gave an explanation that was between logical and absurd, saying, well, he has to have it because he has to know when you're going to be here to prepare meals. So I had to change everything, and we decided to play a ruse on anybody that would want to harm us, and on the press that followed us everywhere. And we decided to say in the program, we actually wrote in the program, that we would leave by helicopter in the afternoon of the second day that we had arrived. Instead, we went the second day at 5 a.m. by cars. And, it was everything very good until we arrived to the Liaquat Bag, and the police put barricades about 2 blocks away, so that we were in an area absolutely free of any vehicles, any people, nothing. But I saw in the distance some people after the barricades that they had put up there. So the commissioner from Ireland, the policeman, told me, you know what it is you're looking at? Those are journalists. And sure enough, there were cameramen and people, photographers with tele lenses who knew that we were there. So the leaking of information was unbelievable. We confronted many of these challenges in the investigation. A government that was very supportive at the beginning, because it was presided by the widower of Benazir Bhutto by President Zardari, began to be very warm and supportive as they were at the beginning, but then as we began to be very serious in the investigation, we didn't feel as welcome as at the beginning. And we had a lot of difficulties, particularly with some individuals, including the Minister of the Interior, who was a point man for contact with us, Rehman Malik, who had been the security person for Benazir Bhutto. And at the time of the assassination, he had been in the backup bulletproof car, a backup car that obviously had to be very near the main car in which Benazir Bhutto rode, and it so happened that it disappeared at the moment of the attack. We never saw it in any of the videos, we never saw it in any of the pictures, and as I interrogated the Minister of the Interior, constantly he avoided answering my questions and saying, well, we'll talk about it next time, and that always was the case. We found out, because of the other occupants in the backup car, that they were between 150 and 250 yards away. They had departed before the convoy had left, and the rule in a convoy is that everybody goes together. And they had left slightly before. And in fact, they heard the bomb, because that's what they testified to us, but nevertheless, they went away to Zardari House, the house of Benazir Bhutto in Islamabad. That is about 25, 30 minutes away. So the car that was there to be the backup leaves. They don't even ask what has happened to Benazir Bhutto. They just leave, probably to save their skin. It so happens that the car of Benazir Bhutto, that was a very good car, a bulletproof car, because of the explosion, had blown the tires. So when they try to get to the hospital, they are riding on the rims of the wheels, and they don't make it. They make it halfway. She has to be transported by a private car, one of the militants, or one of the activists of the party, of the PPP, in order to make it there. She has to be transferred. And of course she dies. She dies. Maybe she would have been saved if she had been taken immediately. It's difficult to say. No autopsy was made because the police impeded it. And the police, 1 hour and a half after the attack, washes the place of the attack with hoses, with fire hoses, so that all the evidence that should have been collected in a site protected was eliminated. We were with Scotland Yard in London, and Scotland Yard told us that in an attack of that nature, thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence would have been collected. Only 23 pieces were collected. So the assassination was full of issues. She was not adequately protected. Musharraf was very mad at her. We found a letter that the Musharraf government has sent to provincial authorities instructing to provide VVIP protection to 2 former prime ministers, but not to Benazir, not to her. Specifically, she was excluded. And the responsibility to protect a former prime minister was that of the state, was that of Musharraf. She was not adequately protected. But in addition to that, there was a cover-up by the police. And the police did not act alone, in my view. They had orders from above. But evidently also, she was hated by the Taliban because she was a woman ruling an Islamic state, because she was a modern woman. She had been raised in the culture of the West. She had gone to a Catholic school in Pakistan. Then she had studied at Harvard and then at Oxford. She spoke better English than Urdu. In fact, she becomes involved in politics once her father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, is killed, is assassinated by the dictator in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, Zia-ul Haq, who trumps up a case to have him hanged. Then she goes into politics. So she was seen as a Western woman, close to the West, close to the United States. In addition to that, somebody would fight for democracy that would come down strongly on extremists. So the Pakistani Taliban clearly hated her, and so did Al-Qaeda. But there were many others that wanted her out, and she distrusted particularly the people around Musharraf. She had sent a letter to Musharraf saying that she feared the people around him, specifically people linked to the intelligence agencies, to the ISI. Hamid Gul was one of them, a former ISI director. Another one was Ijaz Shah, who was the head of another intelligence bureau, and a couple of other individuals who she felt very threatened by. So that was the story that I put up in the book. I felt that I needed to get it out beyond the report that we presented, telling the stories behind it. Last thing to close, when we finished the report, we presented it to the Secretary General. It had a lot of impact in the media, in Pakistan, internationally. And I was with my wife in a subway on Lexington and 59th, and there was an individual walking back and forth in the platform as we waited for the train. And he looked at me, and I thought might have been a Chilean, because I used to be an authority that was of my country, and sometimes when there are tourists, Chilean tourists in town, I've been recognized by some of them. But this guy didn't look like a tourist. And he comes up, walks, looks at me, and he asked me, "Are you Ambassador Muñoz of Chile?" And I said, "Yes, I am." Oh, he says, "You know, I'm Pakistani." He says, "And you are the most wanted person in Pakistan." And I said, "Most wanted in a positive or a negative sense?" And I said that very nervously to him. He said, "No, positively." He said, I've seen you in the television, I've seen you in the press, or your pictures all around. I've seen you the interviews that you gave when you presented the report. You did a great job." He said, "Yeah, I mean, you contributed very strongly to clear up things, but," he said, "your work will be lost. Nothing will happen, because impunity is the rule of thumb in Pakistan. So, you know, the courts won't do anything, and this will be forgotten, because that's the way." And he began to be very passionate, and I moved away and I said, "Thank you very much, my train is coming." So that to close it, to say that this was a very important investigation, and it was important to me, and it opened up the court case in Pakistan, by the way. An anti-terrorist court opened it up, and in fact, today the case is open, and Musharraf has been indicted, even though he has been released on bail on the case of Benazir Bhutto. Final thing, for me, was important because I met her in the early 90s when I was in Washington serving my government, and I went to a U.S. Congress seminar on transition to democracy, and she spoke about Pakistan, I spoke about Chile. And when we sat together, she says to me, sort of whispering, saying, "You know, oh, yeah, I'm so glad to know you," says, "because I love Chile." Said, "My father and I, we are so sorry, so sad when President Salvador Allende was assassinated in the coup d'etat in Chile. And we know that the Americans were behind it, that they supported the right in Chile, and they pushed that military coup because Allende was a socialist and he wanted changes, like my father wanted changes." So I said, "Oh, well, thank you very much." And I said, I felt very close to your father because when I was a graduate student, my best friend in graduate school was a Pakistani, and we exchanged notes about at that time the detention and the overthrow of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto by dictator Ziaul Haq. So I felt, as I said, close to the reality of Pakistan at that time, and then later on, of course, your father was killed by the dictatorship. So I want to thank you and tell you that. And so she gave me a smile and sort of shook my hand. I never had any more conversation with her. You know, the irony would be that 20-some years later, I would be investigating her assassination. So that's what is in the book, and many other things. But thank you very much, and let me hear from you, questions or comments that you may have. Thanks.
So the story you tell, I mean, listening to it, it seems like a story where there's incompetence being used to mask malice, like what you described with what happened with the police investigation, housing down the evidence. Like, when you were there conducting the investigation, did you feel that a lot?
Yeah, I felt that there was incompetence, for sure. But I think there was more than incompetence. I mean, I thought it was acts of malice, in fact, that there was something there that just didn't fit. The decision to wash the site, for example, had not been taken before in other cases, except the military had done that in some cases involving attacks against high military authorities. But the police knew that they had to cordon off and save the evidence. And we heard that there were people or phone calls that were made from the intelligence agencies that might have had an explanation. The other side of it is that the policemen may have thought that an assassination of such an important person had to have higher-ups involved, and they themselves decided to wash up because they better safeguard themselves. That could have been the other explanation. But it wasn't something that was casual, that just simply happened. You know, that was a political decision to do that. Then the decision not to perform the autopsy on Benazir Bhutto in the hospital, that was a decision of the police. The police was responsible for that according to the law in Pakistan. Nevertheless, the policeman, the head of the police, of the local police, impeded the doctors from performing the autopsy. So that was something else that, to me, says that. And he got a phone call from the deputy of ISI. They denied that to us, and then they recognized it. After we showed that we had evidence about that phone call, then they said, oh, yes, we did call, but we called just to know whether she had it was fully clear that she had died, so that to relay that information to our superiors. So these things, my feeling, just don't happen as something that doesn't have a political motivation behind. And Musharraf, he was irate about her having come back, sort of undoing the deal that they had tried to reach, and not providing that security was so important that there was a conversation that now we have a lot of sources backing up the conversation, in which Musharraf tells Benazir Bhutto, when Benazir Bhutto tells him, look, the Americans are going to call you so that you provide me security, and Musharraf says something like, look, the Americans can call all they want, but your security depends on the relationship between you and I. Your security depends on the status of our relationship. That tells you a lot, I think. Yes.
Hi. I wondered if there were any groups claiming credit for doing this that you thought was a reputable claim, and if no one really did try to claim credit for it, why do you think that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was Al-Qaeda claimed credit. They through a spokesperson, a high member, they called a newspaper, the Asia Times, to claim responsibility. And in addition to that, the Musharraf government, but this was something of a boomerang. Less than 24 hours after the assassination, a spokesperson from the Ministry of the Interior comes up and on television and says, this has been committed by Baitullah Maqsood, head of the Pakistani Taliban, of the TTP, one of the major groups of the Pakistani Taliban. And the cause of death was Benazir hitting her head on the lever of the sunroof of the vehicle. How do you, and the question that experts and public opinion posed was, how do you know who did it and the cause of death 24 hours after it has happened? There has been no investigation, nothing. And the Ministry of Interior claimed that because of ISI information, they had a recording of a conversation between Baitullah Masood and some other individual where he congratulated these people for having performed a great deed by having, they didn't say mentioning, by killing Benazir Bhutto. They just sort of indirectly suggested that they were being congratulated because of this terrorist operation. When asked about this, Mr. Baitullah Masood, who was, by the way, a target of the U.S., and finally was taken out in a drone attack in 2009, by the way, he reacted saying, "I didn't do it. I don't attack women. That's against Islamic tribal traditions." But on the other hand, there were a lot of evidence that he felt that Benazir Bhutto was anathema to what he stood for. Benazir wanted an inclusive society, a democratic society. He wanted to come down on extremists. He wanted to control the intelligence agencies, everything that he stood for. In addition to that, she was considered a Shia by these groups, Sunnis, and because her mother was Iranian, Benazir Bhutto's mother, and was a Shia. So that there was that element too. So it is very difficult to conceive that Baitullah Masood wasn't involved, despite the denial. So that in the end, I try to think a lot about the big question. So who did it? And the only thing that comes up to me is a play, a Spanish play, 17th century Spanish play called Fuente Ovejuna. Fuente Ovejuna is a village. And the story goes that this village was ruled by an individual that was quite hated by the population. And one day, this individual is assassinated. And a judge arrives in town to investigate who's the murderer, who assassinated this man. And he begins to interrogate every villager of Fuente Ovejuna. And every villager says Fuente Ovejuna did it. The village did it. And they go one by one, and the judge doesn't find anybody except everybody saying the village did it. Fuente Ovejuna did it. He even tortured some individuals, and they all say Fuente Ovejuna did it. And as a sort of parallel, as a metaphor, I thought, well, Benazir Bhutto, in a sense, was killed by Fuente Ovejuna, was killed by the village, because Al-Qaeda wanted her dead. The Pakistani Taliban executed it through an individual. The actual murderer, the suicide murderer, was a 15-and-a-half-year-old kid, less than 16-year-olds. We were with Scotland Yard, and they were able to determine the exact age. A 16-year-old doesn't do it on his own. So, in fact, we saw a piece of a hand, because that was one of the remains, and there were these drawings that in traditional Pakistan are the drawings that you have for a wedding, because of the idea that he was going to a better place, and he was going to have the big weddings with many girls that would wait for him. So he was manipulated into doing this. Who was behind? But clearly the Pakistani Taliban were involved. The police, local police was involved because they tried to cover up. The people around Benazir, the security people, failed there because they didn't protect her adequately. And I have a lot of anecdotes, aside from the fact that the backup vehicle wasn't there when it should have been. The United States and the UK promoted her return, but they wouldn't take any responsibility for safety. In fact, they said at the beginning, well, look at hiring Blackwater, or some other outfit. And then Musharraf did not allow anybody from abroad, any foreigner, to perform police duties. In addition to that, my perception was that Musharraf was a facilitator because he did not provide the security that she deserved. They knew that she had been attacked. They passed on to her information about cells that were bent on attacking her. But they passed on the information and sort of washed their hands about their duty to protect her. So they were part of it too. And in the end, my perception was that most Pakistani actors would rather turn the page than to know exactly what had happened to her. So there were many. The village assassinated her, in a sense. There were too many people that wanted her dead.
Hey. This is a bit of a naive question, I think, but I'm from California, and I've lived in the United States my whole life. And I just wonder, let's see, I'm trying to think how to pose the question. How it feels like living in a place where there's not law and order in the sense that I think of it here, like under Pinochet or under Musharraf. Is there? I mean, is daily life for people? I mean, substantially different. I mean, you've lived here for some time, so you have a good sense about that.
Yeah. Well, I would say that Chile under the dictatorship was very difficult to live under, and in the end, you adjust. If you decide to confront the dictatorship, it becomes dangerous. And in the case of Pakistan, it's a little bit different. The society has become more radicalized. It was always a very sophisticated society, has a strong middle class, a very learned elite. And that began to change with Zia-ul Haq in the late 1970s and 80s when this radicalization, Islamist radicalization began. You know, the army used to have dinners that they ended drinking port wine. You know, all of that was changed when the strict, Islamic tradition was instituted, and Sharia law and all. So that then the society became different. Of course, people continued drinking, and there was an article yesterday on the Dawn, that one major newspaper, how drinking alcohol was driven underground, but it's still all over the place. And it became a bit more difficult to live, because I remember having gone to Islamabad many years ago before this mission, and Islamabad being a very nice city. Well, today it has all kinds of, every few blocks, roadblocks, manned by individuals with guns and sand sacks and all that. And that has changed. It's become a lot more vulnerable. But people go on living their lives. It's a sophisticated country, sophisticated society. In the case of Chile, it was more or less the same. You go on living. But it becomes difficult at some times. I mean, my life was threatened a couple of times. But then you decide that it is worth it because there's higher objectives. I was arrested in Chile. And my family did not like the idea of me staying in Chile, but we lived through it. But it's very different when you come to the U.S. You see the differences. During the dictatorship, you don't talk in a bus, because don't talk politics, because somebody might hear you that may denounce you. You are very defensive, and that, I think, is a frame of mind that obviously you don't have here, and things are quite different in that sense. You distrust a lot of people that you don't know. You are with a strong circle of friends and a family, and that happens under repression, under dictatorship. But today, Pakistan, to go back to Pakistan, I think is more hopeful than anything else, because for the first time ever, a government finished a full period without being kicked out, without being a coup d'etat. President Sardari finished his term, and he handed over power to a newly elected, democratically elected government of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. And that was a first ever in Pakistan. The problems today in Pakistan are more development issues. Electric power, issues of food security. A country that produced enough to feed all of its population has to import a lot. Issue of energy is fundamental. There are other issues that today are more important. And the radical groups have always been a minority. They never won an election. They never won a national election. So in the end, there's more of a taste for an inclusive society, more if not secular, at least inclusive and tolerant, rather than the strict extremist views that tend to be a minority in Pakistan. And in the case of Chile, as I said, it's a different situation, but we defeated the dictator, and today we've had 20-some years of democracy, and a woman elected president of Chile, like the first woman elected prime minister of Islamic State was Benazir Bhutto, and very possibly next weekend, and I'm going to Chile to vote, Michelle Bachelet will be re-elected president of Chile, I hope at least.
Hi. What's the evidence against Musharraf, and do you think he's the right person to stay on trial for this?
Well, it's not for me to say. It's for the Pakistani courts to decide, and they've opened up a case. An anti-terrorist court in Rawalpindi opened up a case on the assassination of Benazir Bhutto and decided to indict Musharraf. They took a lot of the elements of our report, but they have their own evidence, they have their own means of proof, and that's why I've always said it's not up to anybody outside Pakistan to determine who did this. It's up to the Pakistani justice system to exonerate or to declare culpability. And that's what they're doing right now. So far, different courts have indicted and condemned the chief of police of Rawalpindi and the deputy chief of police, both removed from their posts, and others have been removed from their responsibilities and put into an exit list. In other words, they cannot leave the country until their situation in court is cleared up. So a lot has happened, and in the case of Musharraf, the evidence has been gathered by this court. By the way, the state prosecutor in the case of Benazir Bhutto in this Rawalpindi court was assassinated about 6 months ago or so. His body was riddled with bullets. Many people say because of the Benazir Bhutto case. Others say that it could have been because of other cases involving militants. So that's, we have no evidence that we could present except the political one, the political responsibility. It was his responsibility to protect her. He didn't. He didn't do it adequately. And there's all these other elements. And in the end, she sent a letter to Wolf Blitzer of CNN and said, shortly before the assassination, said, if I'm assassinated, it's because of minions, he used the word minions around Musharraf who did it. But evidently, all of that has to be proven in court, and that's what is happening right now.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much for coming to Google and speaking about it.
Thanks to you for the invitation. Appreciate it. you.